The chair by the window was still pushed in the way Haley always left it, perfectly straight, slightly too far from the desk, like she'd never planned to sit back down. That was the first thing Connor noticed when he walked into the house at 5:30 in the morning. Not the silence, not the dark hallway, the chair. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, keys still in his hand, the smell of Sloane's perfume still clinging to the collar of his shirt. He'd told himself he would shower before Haley woke up. He always did. He had a whole quiet choreography for these mornings. Shoes off at the door, shirt in the laundry room, 30-second shower, back into bed before 6. But the chair. He moved through the kitchen first. The coffee maker was off. That was wrong. Haley Drummond woke up at 5:15 without fail. She'd done it every single day for the 8 years they'd been married. Every day except the 6 weeks after the twins were born, when she'd barely slept at all, when she'd moved through their house like a woman learning to live inside a body that no longer belonged entirely to her. He went up the stairs. The twins' room was empty. Not messy, not rearranged. Empty. Both cribs stripped down to the mattress covers. The small, white dresser still there, but the drawers hanging open, the little folded sleepers and the muslin swaddle cloths, and the 2 stuffed rabbits her mother had sent from Fredericton. All of it gone. Connor stood in the doorway of that pale yellow room for a long time. Long enough that the light outside began to shift, just barely from black to gray. He checked their bedroom next. Her side of the closet had gaps in it. Careful gaps, like she'd thought about exactly what to take. Her makeup bag was gone from the bathroom counter. Her toothbrush. The small framed photo of her and her sister at Peggy's Cove that had sat on the windowsill since before they'd even moved in. He sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. His first thought, and he would never say this to anyone, but it was his first thought, was that she would be back. Haley wasn't the type to leave. Haley was the type to cry quietly in the shower, to pick up after an argument and set the table for dinner, to forgive things she hadn't even named out loud yet. He'd counted on that. He just hadn't realized how long he'd been counting. Haley Drummond had met Connor Aldous in her second year of law school at Dalhousie, in the middle of a November that felt more like February. She'd been in the library, with a thermos of terrible coffee, and 3 highlighters that all ran out in the same week. He was studying for the same exam, at the table beside hers, and he'd lent her a pen and made a joke she couldn't remember anymore, but that had made her laugh loudly enough that the woman across the room had glared. She'd thought then that he was easy to be around, easy to like, easy to trust. She hadn't known yet that ease in a person can be its own kind of trap, that some people are easy in the early days because they're still deciding what they want from you, and once they've figured it out, the ease calcifies into something else entirely. They married 4 years later, in a small ceremony outside Halifax. Her parents came from New Brunswick. His came from Mississauga. It rained. They didn't mind. Haley had articled at a mid-size firm in downtown Halifax, then passed the bar, then built the kind of career that other women at her firm talked about in terms of what they hoped to do someday. She was good. She was careful. She had a particular talent for the unglamorous work of family law, for reading the emotional architecture beneath the financial documents, for knowing when someone was lying about what they needed versus what they wanted. It was almost funny later that she'd missed it so completely in her own marriage. She got pregnant at 32, unexpectedly but not unhappily. Twin girls, Nola and Bea, born 6 weeks early in March, small enough that Haley couldn't stop counting their fingers. Connor was in Toronto when her water broke. He'd been there for 3 days on a deal that was important enough, apparently, to outweigh the fact that his wife was 34 weeks, along with twins. He made it back in time. Barely. She had told herself it didn't matter. She had told herself a great many things in those first months. The sleeplessness was a kind of dismantling, of her patience, of her composure, of the careful structure she'd built around herself since law school. She'd taken the full parental leave because her firm offered it, and because Nola's lungs needed another 6 weeks before anyone felt comfortable calling them truly fine. She was home all day and all night, in the rocking chair, and then the kitchen, and then the rocking chair again, while Connor went back to work after 2 weeks and started coming home later and later, until later became a pattern she didn't have the energy to confront. She found out about Sloane Whitaker in January, when the twins were 9 months old. She hadn't gone looking. She wasn't that kind of person. She had too much professional pride and too much exhaustion to go through her husband's phone. What she found by accident. A credit card statement left open on the laptop, a dinner for two at a restaurant in Dartmouth she'd never been to, a charge at a hotel in the South End, the same night Connor had told her he was at a conference in Moncton. She sat with the laptop open on the kitchen table for a long time. Nola was asleep. Bea was making small sounds from the baby monitor, not distressed, just present. Haley stared at the screen and felt something shift inside her. Not break exactly, more like the slow movement of tectonic plates. Something deep and structural, realigning itself. She didn't say anything that night, or the next night. What she did instead was call her friend, Teresa Munro. Teresa was a family lawyer too, but she worked in a different city. Hamilton, where she'd moved after her second divorce and built a practice that was half litigation and half reputation. She was blunt and organized and had once told Haley that the biggest mistake a woman in trouble makes is waiting until she's in crisis before she calls a professional. Haley called her on a Thursday afternoon in late January while both babies were napping. She stood by the window and spoke quietly and told Teresa everything she knew, which wasn't much yet. Teresa listened. Then she said, "Don't touch anything on the finances yet. Don't move money. Don't change passwords. Don't let on." "What do you know about joint assets?" "Everything," Haley said. "I'm a family lawyer." Teresa. "Then you know what you need to do." She did. Over the next 2 months, Haley Drummond did something she would describe later as quietly building a second floor in a house that was on fire. She didn't stop functioning. She nursed the twins and cooked dinners, and smiled at Connor across the table, and attended a colleague's retirement party, and filed her taxes and made an appointment with the dentist. She did all of it, and underneath all of it, carefully and methodically, she documented bank statements, copies of their joint investment portfolio, records of what she had contributed to the down payment on their house in Bedford, her own savings from years before the marriage, which she'd been too trusting to put in a separate account, but which she had the transaction records for. A timeline of Connor's business travel, cross-referenced with the hotel charges and the restaurant bills. Screenshots of nothing she'd obtained improperly. Everything on paper, everything hers to access. She called Teresa twice more. She also met, in person, with a Halifax family lawyer named Priya Okonkwo, who worked on the other side of town from Haley's firm, and therefore had no professional entanglements. Priya was matter-of-fact in a way Haley appreciated. She didn't offer sympathy unless Haley asked for it. She offered strategy. "He's going to fight the asset split," Priya told her at their second meeting. "He's already positioned himself as the primary earner during leave." "I was on parental leave," Haley said. "That's not the same as not working." "It won't be by the time we're done," Priya said. In February, Haley had coffee with Connor's assistant, a young woman named Gwen who had worked for him for 3 years, and who had begun leaving small silences in conversations that Haley was only now learning to read. She didn't ask Gwen anything directly. She didn't need to. Gwen mentioned, almost in passing, that Connor had asked her to rebook his flights to Montreal twice in the past month because of scheduling conflicts. Haley knew he hadn't been to Montreal. She had the hotel receipts for the dates in question. Gwen met her eyes over the rim of her mug. "He's not a careful man," Gwen said. "He just thinks he is." Haley drove home and sat in the car in the garage for 4 minutes. Then she went inside and fed Nola her afternoon bottle and thought about what it means to know something with your whole body while your mind is still working out how to name it. Connor told her about Sloane in March, not because he felt guilty. He told her because Sloane had apparently grown impatient, and Connor, who had always responded to impatience by giving people what they wanted, had decided that what he wanted was to be honest. That was the word he used. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and said he wanted to be honest with her, and Haley looked at him and thought, "You've been lying to me for almost a year, and you're calling this honesty." She didn't say that. She said, "How long?" "About 8 months. Do you love her?" A pause. "I think so." She nodded. She asked him if he wanted a divorce. He said he thought it would be better for everyone. She asked him to sleep in the guest room while they figured things out. He seemed almost relieved. What he didn't know was that, by that evening, Haley had already forwarded the asset documentation to Priya Okonkwo's secure file server. She had already arranged for her mother to drive up from Fredericton. She had already identified a 2-bedroom in the South End that allowed month-to-month, had already confirmed with her firm's HR department that she could return from parental leave 6 weeks early. She had been ready for 2 months. The hard part wasn't leaving. The hard part was the 3 weeks between his confession and the morning she went. 3 weeks of living in a house where the air had changed, where Connor moved with a new energy that she recognized as anticipation, where she heard him on the phone after midnight and chose not to listen. She thought about Nola and Bia constantly, about what they would understand, eventually, about what they'd been born into. She thought about what she wanted them to see in her. Not the woman who had stood at the kitchen window trying to decide if she was overreacting. Not the woman who had folded her grief into the shape of dinners and dentist appointments. She wanted them to see someone who had, when it mattered, decided to move. Her mother, Ruth Drummond, arrived on a Wednesday evening with her Subaru and a lasagna and very few words. She was a practical woman from a practical family, and she had known from Haley's voice in January that something was wrong and had not pushed but had stayed near in the way that certain women know how to stay near. Close enough to hear, far enough to give room. They moved on a Thursday morning. Connor was at the office by 8. By 10, Haley's mother had the twins strapped in the back of the Subaru while Haley carried the last bags to the car. She went through the house once more, checking rooms. She left nothing she needed. She left the chair by the window pushed in the way she always left it. She drove out of Bedford without looking in the rearview mirror and did not allow herself to feel triumphant. Because it wasn't triumph yet. It was only the end of one thing, and the beginning of something that was going to be harder in different ways. The divorce proceedings began in April. Connor had retained a lawyer named Patrick Elgin, who worked out of a downtown firm that handled mostly corporate law, and seemed slightly surprised to find themselves navigating a marriage dissolution. His opening position, communicated through Elgin, was what Haley had expected, a fairly even asset split, with Connor retaining primary custody of the twins during the school week, on the grounds that Haley's return to full-time work constituted a material change in her ability to provide primary care. She read the letter at Priya's office. "He wants the twins during the week," Haley said. "He's listed himself as the primary financial provider," Priya said, "and implied that your leave constitutes a gap in professional stability." Haley put the letter down very carefully on the desk between them. "He hasn't been present for a single pediatric appointment since they were born. I have every record. He was in Toronto when I went into early labor. He came home for 2 weeks post-birth and then went back to work. The twins' GP hasn't met him." "I know," Priya said. "We'll say exactly that." What followed was the part of the process that nobody warns you about. Not the grief, but the bureaucracy of the grief. The disclosure forms and the net family property statements and the affidavits and the scheduling of proceedings and the emails from Elgin that were civil in a way that felt designed to be destabilizing. Haley answered every email. She did not answer quickly, because Priya had advised her that pace communicates composure, and Haley was composure in those months out of sheer necessity. She was also, at the same time, back at work. Her firm had welcomed her return with the careful warmth of an institution that had learned, from experience, not to underestimate what a woman on parental leave had been doing. Her senior partner, a man named Douglas who had known her since her articling days, had scheduled a meeting her first week back and asked what she needed. She told him, and he arranged it. A modified schedule for the first 2 months, a private office, a parking space that wasn't in the underground so she could load and unload the car more easily. She worked. She came home to the 2-bedroom in the South End, where her mother had stayed through April, and then where Teresa drove up from Hamilton for a long weekend in May, and where her downstairs neighbor, a retired teacher named Beverly, had started leaving containers of soup outside her door on Thursday evenings without any explanation beyond a note that said, "Figured you could use it." Some kindnesses don't require context. Connor moved Sloan Whitaker into the Bedford house in May. Haley heard this from Gwen, who had quit her job the previous month, and sent Haley a text that read, simply, "I thought you should know." She hadn't asked for anything more. At the disclosure meeting in early June, Connor's financial statement contained an omission that Priya had expected but still found satisfying. He had not listed the freelance consulting work he'd been doing for a former colleague off the books for the better part of a year. Haley knew about it because she had, during their marriage, helped him review 2 of the contracts. She had copies. They were on Priya's server. "This changes things," Priya said, looking at the financial disclosure with the flat expression of someone who has seen this particular trick before. "It changes his credibility with the court," Haley said. "Yes," Priya said, "it does." The custody hearing was scheduled for July. In the 2 weeks before the hearing, Connor's lawyer made 3 separate requests to adjourn. Each one was denied. Haley had the twins' full medical records, every appointment, every immunization, every follow-up visit after Nola's respiratory scare in December. She had testimony from the twins' daycare, which they'd started attending in May, confirming that Haley was the primary contact on all forms and the parent who attended every meeting. She had a statement from the family GP, who confirmed she had met Connor Aldous once, briefly, in the parking lot, and that Haley Drummond had attended every scheduled appointment for both children, including several unscheduled ones, since the twins' discharge from hospital. Connor arrived at the courthouse with Elgin and a new suit, and the expression of a man who has miscalculated the difficulty of something but refuses to acknowledge it publicly. Haley arrived with Priya in a binder and her reading glasses, and the measured quiet of someone who had been preparing for this for 6 months. The judge was a woman in her 50s named Justice Leanne Fortier, who had been on the bench long enough to have seen every version of this particular case, and who had, Haley suspected, very little patience for fathers who claimed involvement in children's lives they had not actually been present for. Elgin made his opening arguments. He presented Connor as a dedicated provider and a capable parent who had supported his wife's career before and during the marriage. He suggested, without quite saying it directly, that Haley's return to full-time employment raised reasonable concerns about her capacity to meet the twins' developmental needs. Priya let him finish. Then she stood up and began. She laid out the timeline with the precision that Haley had come to expect from her. Not dramatic, just clear. The early birth and the 2 weeks Connor had taken before returning to work, the pediatric records, the GP's statement, the daycare enrollment, the consulting income that had not appeared on the financial disclosure, the hotel receipts and the credit card statements, not offered as evidence of infidelity in any legal sense, but as evidence of where Connor Aldous had actually been during the months he was representing himself as a hands-on father to 2 premature infants. Connor's jaw tightened. Elgin made a note. Justice Fortier asked 3 questions, all of them directed at Elgin, all of them requiring specific answers he did not have. The recess lasted 45 minutes. Haley sat with Priya in the hallway and drank the worst coffee she'd had since law school and did not allow herself to think too far ahead, because she had learned in this particular year that the practice of not thinking too far ahead was a form of self-preservation. When they returned to the courtroom, Justice Fortier spoke for 11 minutes. What she awarded primary residency of Nola and Bia to Haley. She outlined a structured access schedule for Connor, every second weekend, with a review provision in 18 months based on demonstrated involvement. She noted, for the record, that the financial disclosure matter would be referred for further review. She did not editorialize. She didn't need to. Haley walked out of that courthouse with Priya beside her, and the Halifax summer landing on her shoulders like something she'd forgotten was possible. Warmth, just warmth, plain and uncomplicated. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let herself feel it. Then she called her mother. Ruth Drummond answered on the second ring, the way she always did, and Haley could hear both girls in the background, Nola doing the high-pitched talking sound she'd started doing in June, Bia quieter but present. "It went the way it needed to," Haley said. A pause. Then her mother said, "Good," in the same tone she'd used when Haley had called her from the parking lot in Dalhousie after passing her bar exam. Not effusive, just solid. Like the thing that had been in question was never really in question at all. Haley drove back to the South End. She changed out of her court clothes and picked up the twins from Beverly, who'd watched them that morning. Nola grabbed her collar with both fists. Bia put her head down on Haley's shoulder and made a long, slow exhale that sounded absurdly like relief. She stood in her kitchen that evening and made scrambled eggs for dinner because she didn't have the energy for anything more than that. And she put on music low enough that she could still hear the girls in the next room. And she thought about all the nights in the Bedford house, when she'd stood in a kitchen almost exactly like this one, and tried to convince herself that she was fine, that the situation was manageable, that she was someone who knew how to hold things together. She'd been right about that last part, at least. She had known how to hold things together. She just needed to finally decide which things were worth holding. Connor sold the Bedford house in September. She heard this through Gwen, who still sent occasional brief texts with no preamble, just information, offered matter-of-factly, the way useful people offer things. Haley didn't respond with much beyond a thank you, but she meant it. There are people who show up in the middle of other people's crises and ask for nothing, and she had learned this year that such people are not as rare as she'd once thought. They are just often quieter than the noise. In October, she was appointed to lead a new family mediation initiative at her firm, something Douglas had been developing for a year and had held for her return. She said yes. She knew how to do the work, and she knew why it mattered, and she was no longer in the habit of second-guessing what she was capable of. The twins turned 1 in March. She had a small party. Her mother, Teresa, over from Hamilton, Priya and her husband, Beverly from downstairs, a handful of close friends. Nola sat in the middle of a blanket and treated the whole occasion with deep suspicion. Bea ate an unacceptable amount of icing and didn't seem remotely sorry about it. Haley took a photograph of both of them, sticky-faced, squinting against the afternoon light coming through the living room window, and thought, this is it. Not the ending of something, or the beginning of something. Just this, just the light and the noise and the sugar and the people who had shown up. She framed it and put it on the windowsill, next to the photo from Peggy's Cove. The chair in her new living room was never pushed in quite straight. She'd noticed it early on and decided she didn't mind. There were things that had belonged to the old life and things that belonged to this one, and the chair, off-center, slightly askew, hers, was the latter. She left it exactly where it was.